Hey everyone, welcome back to Alf's Mustang Garage. Today we're back working on our 66 Mustang Fastback, doing a 289 conversion from a 6-cylinder. So where we left you off was we installed the engine. So the engine is in the car. So she's all bolted in. The rear end's bolted in. We got this big old gap right here. So today we're gonna put a transmission in this car. So if you hadn't had a chance yet and you want to follow us along, just go ahead and subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell. Those things do help us out a lot when it comes to continuing to make videos which are helpful for you guys. So let's talk about this for a minute. So in terms of converting, your transmission in itself isn't drastically different from a 6-cylinder car to a V8 car. Now there will be an extra clutch pack inside here to kind of handle a little bit more torque and power. So we had this transmission built by our friends at Andy's Classic Mustangs in Spokane. AJ there's a transmission wizard. So you will need a different bell, you will need a flex plate, you will need a different torque converter. The cross member is the same, the transmission mount is the same, the cooler lines are going to be different. There's the mount right there. It is the same on a 6-cylinder transmission. So bolt wise, you'll have to get different bolts for the bell housing. The trans mount bolts are going to be the same. The flex plate bolts actually are going to be the same, so we just kind of clean them up and reuse them. There is going to be a separator plate that is different. These flex plates get a little reinforcement plate. So this one was actually on the 6-cylinder, so we pulled it off. We're going to reuse that. So inside the car, on the engine side, things to note in preparation. This is a freshly rebuilt engine, but if you're not doing that, if you're just kind of using what you've got, I like to always make sure these are sealed up. You got oil galley plugs back here. Reseal those. Rear main seal. This is something very interesting, okay? Our machine shop has the ability to machine these old 289s to give us a one-piece rear main seal and ditch the 2-piece that's inside the oil pan. So that's a huge improvement on this. So that's in there ready to go. Make sure there's no clutch pilot bearing if your old engine had a manual transmission and you're using an automatic. So we are using an automatic. So make sure your dowel pins are in. You got your accelerator bell crank on. That's the kick down lever. So this thing is good to go. Let's get started. I can't tell you how many times I've forgotten this dang thing and gotten a clutch all set up or a flex plate all set up. This is your first thing. So we went ahead and had this one refurbished. You can get replacements of this. But that's your separator plate. Starter hole goes on the passenger side there. So let's get that. And now we're gonna get a flex plate and the reinforcement plate. Now, before the flex plate goes on, these holes, okay, they pass through into the crankcase, which means if you don't seal these bolts, you will have like a slow little oil seepage coming through the bolt holes and coming down into the coming down and leaking out of the bell housing. Kind of looks like a rear main, but these will get you. So make sure we seal those, and I'll show you what we do to seal them. Your flex plate, you can pick these up locally. They usually still sell them. Very handy kind of stuff. They only go on one way, so like naturally it's kind of like popped out. So it just like kind of like naturally like does not fit there. So we have to flip it over and then install it here. Now also with this 6-bolt pattern, that also goes on only one way, and that's the way right there. So we'll go backwards one and see how the bolts they just don't line up at all. So that right there is how those go. Okay, so I just learned something, just so you know, just because I work on Mustangs for a living, I don't know everything there is to know about Mustangs. I try to say this fairly frequently. There's always something to learn on these cars. You don't know everything, you won't ever know everything. You can know a lot, but it's a huge thing. So, 6-cylinder reinforcement plates. Obviously the crank bolt patterns are a 6-bolt pattern, but they're just different just enough that you have to get a V8 reinforcement plate here. So the 6-cylinder one that came off is not going to be used. So here's an ACP version there for you. I'll post a link in the description for that one. Let's get this lined up before we set it up in there. Okay, so I swear this isn't the first time we've installed a flex plate, but what we've learned, because we don't know everything there is to know, these separator plates, it matters what side goes what, because there was no possible way that this would line up on this side. We went through every single possibility. We flipped it over and there was only one position that it fits, and it's on this side. So it's much easier to do this in your lap, make sure all the bolts actually fit through, mark it with a Sharpie marker, and then throw this up on the crankshaft. Okay, so now that we have these together, we can go ahead and kind of just get one bolt in to hold it in place. Just kind of like that. Okay, all the holes definitely line up. So now we're going to start sealing some bolts, tightening those ones. We'll take those two back out and seal those up. When it comes to sealing these bolts, we like using the right stuff, or any sort of Permatex, ultra black, oil resistant kind of stuff. That's what's going to seal these bolts. Okay, now I kind of try to pay attention to forums and Facebook groups just to kind of see what kind of advice is being given out there. And this is the advice is to use a thread locker like this, or Loctite brand kind of stuff. And that's going to be good for locking your bolt in, but this stuff won't seal against oil. It'll tell you right on the bottle, it's not going to stop oil from making its way through there. So it's just not how it works. It won't harden with the oil. So we put a thin coat of right stuff is what we're going to use. You don't have to go crazy with this stuff. We just kind of put a little bit of on our fingers, roll it around into the threads, and throw her in. Okay, in case you didn't kind of notice, tighten these suckers in a pattern, just like how you would a tire. And that way the flex plate goes on nice and even, and now you're ready to torque it down. Okay, to torque this flex plate bolt down, let me see that crank holding tool that we use. This thing I got off Amazon, and it's just kind of like a universal crank holding tool. It works fantastic if you're just trying to hold the crank, and it's not, you can actually do this by yourself too. So get that held in place. Come over here and torque down your bolts. Okay, so the torque spec on this is 75 to 85. So I'm gonna put it right to 80. Okay, so this is the point where I usually realize I forgot my my separator plate. So in case I didn't mention it before, don't forget your separator plate. So flex plate is on, bolts are torqued and sealed, the reinforcement plate is on. We are now essentially ready for a transmission, okay? But before we install that, we want to install our torque converter. But before we install our torque converter, we're gonna prime it with a little bit of Motorcraft Type F. Okay, I definitely like to prime my torque converters, especially on a brand new one like this. So the only Type F fluid that I use is Motorcraft. I will have a link in the description for that. So we like to pour it in, and then what Justin's going to do is kind of tip the torque converter on its side and let it kind of, you know, circulate a little bit throughout the system. In?
Yeah.
So what Justin's doing is just kind of like rolling it on the table and kind of allowing that fluid to kind of circulate a little bit. So we already have 1 full quart in there, and we're just going to add a little bit more.
Yeah.
Room for more?
More.
All right. So the stance we kind of take on priming these torque converters is we like to try and get as much in there as possible. Now, obviously you can only get so much before it's just kind of pouring out when you tip it on its side, but the more you can get in there and circulate, the better it's going to be for your first fire up. We're just going to keep repeating this until it's kind of, you know, flowing out of the snout. Okay, so with it tipped on its side, you can kind of see the fluid starting to roll out of there. We got 2.5 quarts in this torque converter, so that's a good fair amount. Yeah, and again, the more you can get in there, the better, but looks like 2.5 for a V8 C4 converter is going to be the trick. Okay, so now we're going to put just a little bit of that transmission fluid around the snout of that torque converter, and then we're going to slide her in place. Now you have a couple sets of splines that you need to like rotate this thing and kind of get it in place before you're going to call it good.
Yeah.
And typically you know it's all the way in when you can't fit your fingers behind it, and your studs are not going to stick out past your bell. They're inside the bell. So that's typically how we know that she's fully installed. And typically there's like a couple sets of splines that you'll kind of feel kind of, you know, spline in as you install that. Okay, I think I almost forgot the most important part. I like to sign my name. What's today? 13th?
13th.
There we go. Okay. Another thing you want to kind of keep in mind before you just like chuck this thing up in here is I like to put my I like to line up my holes for my torque converter studs. Okay, so I strategically put one down just so I can kind of have, you know, a line of sight on there. And then your torque converter, you're going to have some drain plugs. Some torque converters have 2 drain plugs. That's what these large holes are for. If you don't line that up correctly, you're going to put that drain plug into the flex plate and you're going to have problems. So make sure you kind of line up your torque converter and your flex plate accordingly. So one more time, just in case I didn't quite make 100% sense, there's only like 3 holes here, not 4. So like if you put your drain plug for your 2 drain plugs for your torque converter like opposite, you know, you're gonna hit a drain plug into the flex plate right here, and this one will be fine, but this one won't. So you got to make sure those drain plugs are lined up in this location. Okay, so transmission is bolted up to the engine now. The studs on the torque converter are poking through. Those drain plug bolts I pointed out are kind of safe, and so she is in. So before we go all the way in, we can go ahead and put a transmission mount up in place. I also like to get my transmission cooler lines on because it's like way easier to reach up in here with a wrench before I lift this transmission all the way up into place. So that's what we're gonna do now. So the transmission cooler lines are going to be different on a 6-cylinder versus a V8. So you can get these from Classic Tube. I will post a link in the description, but they're all pre-bent. They're not going to be 1000% perfect, but they're going to get you right where you need to be, and you can kind of finesse them from there. Okay, go ahead and slide that up and over the steering linkage. Okay, so I'm gonna come back a little bit. This bend is gonna go around.
Yep. Right there.
There. So that's kind of like how those transmission lines go, and then they'll kind of, you know, bend all around the engine oil and be right there for when eventually we get our radiator in place. Okay, so this is like way easier to work with this now. Get these in place before you jack your transmission all the way up in there. This is what I mean by they're not going to be perfect, but it gets you right in the ballpark, and you can kind of finesse them. Make sure your O-ring is up there in your fitting here on this back fitting. These front ones, I haven't noticed that they put O-rings in them because they kind of seal up like a brake line. But this back one typically will have an O-ring in there. As you can see, by doing this with the engine, or I'm sorry, the transmission slightly downward, it's a little easier to get your wrench up in here now and then fully install your trans. So, okay, get that. Let me just kind of do a final little snug with my line wrench. Okay, she should be good. Okay, so now your tranny lines are all in there. We're just gonna go up with the transmission. Usually I kind of take her all the way up, get our cross member in place. Just like that, yeah, you just have these longer bolts that go through. Get a nut on the back side, get your studs to come through for the mount. Get all your nuts and bolts on and tighten her down. Now you can lower your trans jack or floor jack. Unless you're kind of a little lucky like me, I kind of love the 2-post lifts in the trans jack.
Okay, I'll tighten those up later.
Okay, the only thing you got left here is a Speedo cable. We gotta do all of our torque converter nuts and linkage, but I think we're just gonna gonna wrap up this video here pretty soon. Kind of throw our Speedo cable in. That thing doesn't have to change when converting from a 6 to an 8. It's the same length. Your gearing might be a little different if you're changing the rear end like us, but yeah, throw that in there. It's got a little retainer bolt and an O-ring, and there's supposed to be a little factory clip right here that kind of secures that in spot as well. So you got a couple little bolts that go right here for your little cover, but before we put the cover on, we're gonna turn this over and install all the torque converter nuts. So the trick here, these are locking nuts, so they're not gonna like turn on super smooth. So the trick is you're gonna like install them, but you're not gonna like tighten it all down. You want to just kind of get them on there just enough, and then you're going to rotate the engine around. Let me see another one of those nuts. I can get one through the starter hole. Get that one right there through the starter hole. Okay, go ahead and crank the engine over. Okay. Okay. Okay, now that you have all 4 of them started, now you can tighten these suckers down. There's one. Two. 3. That's one. Okay, so you got these new little covers here. We're just gonna throw that on. Okay, well, this car is just kind of coming right along here. So engine's in, transmission's in, rear end's in. We got fuel lines, brake lines, park brake cables, steering, suspension, brakes. We're gonna kind of start moving on to, you know, sway bars and cross members and starter motors and radiators and all the other little things that are just kind of make this car what it is. So but that's a transmission install. Hopefully that's a little more in depth than anything I've done in the past as far as like how to install your transmission, give you little tidbits and things like that. So anyways, if you found the video to be helpful, go ahead and give us a thumbs up. Those little things do go a long ways, and go ahead and subscribe to the channel, hit the notification button, and you can kind of follow us along here. So until then, we'll catch you on the next video.